Good afternoon, everybody. A game of two halves. As you can see from the title, it's a talk on the 21st Division in 1918. 1918, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know whether people agree, is probably the most neglected year of the war and the least studied. So let's see what happens with this one. 21st Division's last meaningful action of 1917 had been an attack on the village of Reutel on the 4th of October, this being part of the Battle of Broodseinde, one of the latter stages of Third Ypres. And it had cost them over 2,500 casualties for reasonably limited objectives gained, actually. Anyway, they were moved out of the salient in December and spent the winter months in what they regarded as a cushy sector, opposite the town of Epée. A certain Lieutenant Ellenberger of the 9th King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry wrote home to his parents, "The Boche are the best part of a mile away. We are pretty comfortable." Well, in February 1918, the division, like many others on the Western Front, underwent a drastic reorganization, losing one battalion per brigade. The 21st Division now looked like this. And I don't expect you to memorize it, obviously, but let me explain the title before we go any further. A game of two halves. I shall be looking at three defensive actions against those German spring offensives, Michael, Georgette and Blücher-Yorck, and three offensive actions during the 100 days. One on the Somme, one approaching, just after the Selle, and one moving on from the Somme quite late on in the advance. The first of these defensive actions was in March 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, or codenamed Operation Michael. 21st Division was still in their cushy sector, opposite Epée, near the northern boundary of the 5th Army. I don't expect you to pick out the detail on that, but just generally speaking, that's the whole of the front of Operation Michael, and 21st Division is there, right in the middle. An attack, of course, was expected, but Major General Campbell, commanding 21st Division, I apologise for the quality of the picture. That is the only one I've ever found of him actually during the Great War, and that is actually just a little part of a group photograph. The only other photograph I've ever found is of him in his old age. But anyway, there he is. He had quite a length of time to think about how he was going to defend his sector. And again, don't worry about the complicated map. I shall simplify that. His frontage contained two natural defence positions. There's Chapel Hill, which is right up towards the top of the centre of that slide, and the twin villages of Epée and Pézières, which are where all those yellow dots are with the letters in them. Now, those little dots are actually a network of redoubts or posts that were set up in the village to defend it. Between the two, there was a farm, Vaucelet Farm, garrisoned, yes, but not so advantageously placed as the other two. Now, these three positions were in the battle zone, the one supposedly back from the front line. But unfortunately, geography dictated they weren't actually that far back from the front line, literally a couple of hundred yards. That was a problem for Campbell, and he wasn't going to let his forward units be overrun in the first stages of any German attack. Once it was clear that an attack was imminent, the order would go out, man battle stations, that would be issued, and the forward zone would be largely evacuated. Everybody would move back, leaving only observation parties behind who'd send up SOS signals if and when an attack began. Most of the troops would by then be back in the battle zone. It looked something like this, and again, that's quite complicated. Let's simplify things. Okay, there's the ground. Epée is marked, that's the village. Chapel Hill, towards the top, Vaucelet Farm I mentioned. Malassy's farm becomes important a little later on, and Guyancourt and Saulcourt are on the, I think it's the third line back in the defences. There's your front line. The yellow line, which is the first reserve line. Then the brown line. The brown line wasn't actually so much of a line, other than actually being on a map, because they hadn't actually dug the trench at this point. They hadn't got round to it yet. It was on the map, there were troops along it, but it wasn't a continuous defensive position. German lines, the black ones up the top right there. Okay, we had first links right up on the left, 62nd Brigade, 12th, 13th Northumberland Fusiliers. Then came 110th Brigade, 7th Leicesters, 8th Leicesters, and the 6th. Second links were in reserve, and the 1st East Yorks, part of 64th Brigade, had been moved up just in case they were needed. Now, as we all know, the offensive did come, launched on 21st of March. Campbell's battle stations order worked exactly as he had hoped. The German artillery bombardment fell on largely empty front trenches, and it also, funnily enough, concentrated behind the red line positions, between the red and the yellow, so not doing a lot of harm at all. The 8th Leicesters, there they are in the front, at Épée-Pézières, they were able to report very few casualties, and that, I quote, all ranks were fully prepared for the appearance of the hostile infantry. And there they came. These men of the 8th Leicesters, they poured rifle and machine gun fire into the advancing German ranks. Now, suffering heavily and perhaps surprised at the intensity of the welcome they got, they went to ground in the recently vacated British front-line trenches. Unfortunately, the fog and the smoke meant that the artillery's forward observers weren't able to call down artillery fire on the enemy's new positions, but small arms fire was intense and accurate enough to stall any resumption of the attack. On the left, things hadn't gone quite as well. A party of about 200 Germans had pushed through the 12th, 13th Northumberland Fusilier positions, there they go, and one of the redoubts at the northern end of Pézières had been captured. The Germans had also been able to outflank Vaucelet Farm to the south and threaten the Chapel Hill defences. Stout defence from the 7th Leicesters, those at the northern end of the village, including a Private Thomas Hickin of that battalion, who repeatedly walked along the parapet of his trench, firing his Lewis gun from the hip, and stopped several attacks by German soldiers equipped with the flamethrowers. Unfortunately, Hickin was eventually killed. I have checked him out and I can't find any record of a gallantry award, but he probably deserved one. But anyway, counterattacks by the second links steadied the position, drove them back. It was getting on for about midday at this point. The redoubts in Épée and Pézières were still in British hands, and the Leicesters were able to stop the Germans' second attempt at forcing the villagers late in the afternoon. Now, all that looks great. Although 21st Division lines had held, though, 16th Division on the right was in trouble. And that farm that I mentioned earlier, Malassy's farm, had actually fallen at around 11 o'clock, threatening the 21st Division's right flank. Meanwhile, the German incursion north of the villages had reached and occupied a stretch of the yellow line trenches as well. So just after 6 p.m, the 15th DLI were ordered to retake it. And there they come. Despite facing heavy machine gun fire, they were actually successful. It cost the battalion 42 dead, however, including their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Festing. Now, he was incidentally, the 4th commanding officer of the 15th DLI to lose their lives in the war. He'd only taken command on 24th of February, And unfortunately, their luck didn't last the rest of the year. They actually lost a 5th commanding officer later on. Anyway, night fell, with the 21st Divisions therefore largely intact, one of the very few positions along the entire line that you could say that. The German attacks had pretty much halted. During the night, however, about 2:35 to be precise, orders came from 7th Corps that the division's right flank was to be extended to try and keep touch with 16th Division, who'd been driven even further back, almost as far as the Brown Line. One company of East Yorks was sent forward accordingly to bolster that right flank. So at 4 a.m. on the 22nd of March, the Germans began to shell those villages, Épée and Pézières again, and the Leicesters prepared to hold on a bit longer. The German infantry assault began about 8 o'clock and included an outflanking advance from the south. Now, with German troops infiltrating Épée from the south, attacking the redoubts from the rear and threatening to cut off the entire garrison, the order to withdraw to Saulcourt, which you can see bottom left, was finally and reluctantly given at about 9:30. So a fighting withdrawal, the 8th of Leicester's diary called it, under very difficult circumstances, ensued. Those who could attempted to move back along communication trenches, but unfortunately these only stretched so far back. As I said, the Brown Line wasn't even a line of trenches, and the communication trenches certainly hadn't been dug or finished. And unfortunately the Germans had their machine guns trained on the exits to those communication trenches. That is complicated. I'm not even going to try to go into the detail of that one. That simply shows you the routes taken way back beyond the Brown Line, back to the Green Line by pretty much every unit. If we just speak briefly about the Leicesters again, many were surrounded and captured. Lieutenant Colonel William Stewart, commanding officer 6th Leicesters, was killed. And the Leicesters suffered over 1,200 casualties, 800 of which, however, were classed as missing, and most of these, it seems, were actually captured. The 62nd Brigade troops to the north of the villages were now in untenable positions and began their withdrawal around midday. On that Brown Line, 64th Brigade, until now not particularly seriously engaged, they were on slightly higher ground. They'd been watching, they'd been spectating what was going on in front of them. They were given the unenviable task of holding out long enough to cover their compatriots' withdrawal to that Green Line. The 9th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, in elevated positions north-east of Guillancourt, first saw the Germans advancing from Pézières and Chapel Hill at about 2:30. That's represented by the black arrows, by the way. Those are the German advances. Rifle and Lewis gunfire and 2 Vickers machine guns sent to cover the right flank halted the Germans as they crested the ridge in front of the Coiley positions. And the War Diary reckons they killed around 250 Germans that afternoon. It's, as usual, it's probably an exaggeration. The problem, as before, though, came from the right. The 1st East Yorks were pushed back into Saulcourt about 5 o'clock, and before long the village was lost. Lieutenant Colonel McCulloch, commanding 9th Coiley, was watching this worrying develop from the high ground and seeing the Germans advancing now northwards and behind him, realised they had to get out now or face being surrounded. Fortunately, they did manage to withdraw, but only according to the Coiley diary, because the enemy had been wonderfully unenterprising as they made for Liermont. As with all withdrawals in the face of the enemy, losses, of course, were inevitable. By the time the 9th Coiley reached that Green Line, they were down to 16 officers and 160 other ranks. Now, the details of the next 6 days needn't worry us here and now particularly, but I just put that up to show you how far indeed they did move back, all the way along the north bank of the Somme. That's the Somme River meandering along there. You can see Albert, top left. So all the way from what was the Green Line, way back across the Ancre eventually. By 25th of March, on the way back, numbers were so low, it was decided that one composite brigade would be formed from the whole division under command of Brigadier General Headlam, 64th Brigade, there he is. Other stragglers were formed into another unit under Lieutenant Colonel McCulloch, and both of these were able to escape across the Ancre River on the 27th, when thankfully the 3rd Australian Division turned up and took their places in the line. 21st Division, or what was left of it, those are the casualty figures. As you can see, none of the battalions came out with less than 300 casualties. Again, the actual numbers, the detail doesn't matter, it's just a high number. Also important, of course, is that bottom line on that slide. Out of the 4,700, 2,639 were missing, and as I said before, most of those turned out to be captured. So, 21st Division was then transferred out of the Somme area, transferred to 2nd Army on the 1st of April, and found themselves in the southern sector of the Ypres salient. As they settled in, the 21st Division General Staff diary noted that the 5th of April passed quietly, there being little activity on either side. That welcome respite, of course, was not to last. In the meantime, new drafts arrived to fill up the depleted ranks. Again, exact details not important, but enough to note that the numbers are high. It's a total of 3,800. I haven't put slides up for the months all the way through 1918, but they're all pretty similar. All the way through 1918, they were taking in at least 1,500 and sometimes over 3,000 replacements every month. By the middle of April, 21st Division dispositions looked like this. You can see Ypres at the very top of the slide there, and bottom middle is Kemmel Hill. Positioned mostly to the south of Ypres on the White Sheets to Messines Ridge Road. That's 21st Division's area mainly. Most of them anyway. 110th Division was slightly detached in what was called the outpost line southeast of Ypres. They were up there, top right. And the positions on the right, in front of Mount Kemmel, down here, were actually held by the French. Our story, of course, concentrates on that central section there, which in detail looks like that. Again, I'll point out the main areas of interest. The Battle of the Lys, the Georgette offensive, had begun on the 9th of April, further to the south. And since then, units have been moved to and fro in the sector, expecting an attack at any time. 21st Division was a little bit scattered, therefore. However, it was decided on 10th of April that the town of White Sheets should be retaken. That's just at the bottom there, below the black line, which is the German front line. The task fell to the 12th, 13th Northumberland Fusiliers and the 2nd Links of 62nd Brigade. As this is a section on defensive actions, all I'm going to say about that is the attack was a success. And the village was held until the Germans counterattacked on the 16th. It did cost 60 Brigade 750 casualties though. Whole situation along this front was fluid. Captain Harold Yeo, 64th Brigade Staff Officer, wrote home to his mother on the 13th of April, quote, "One can't analyse the situation at all, chiefly because one doesn't know much about it." And that's from the staff. Anyway, by 25th of April, this was the situation. 1st East Yorks were in Honrate Wood, which are the two yellow squares towards the bottom right. 9th Coily were way back near the Viverbeck stream. You can see them here, bottom left. And the 15th DLI were much further up to the north, just under the title, as it happens, near Dickerbush Lake. Obviously, as I said, you don't have to remember the details. Just look out for the yellow and red rectangles on the map and where the arrows appear. The main thrust of the German attack, when it finally came in on the 25th, was to the south against the French sector, the initial target being the capture of Mount Kemmel. Initial success was rapid. The hill was overrun very, very quickly. But luckily for the British, and I suppose the French, the German timetable actually required a pause built in order to bring up artillery for the next stage of the attack. So let's return now to the British sector. The defensive system consisted of the front line, shared by units of the 9th Division, the Vierstraat line and the Cheapside line. That's the two red and that yellow one in between. So, the German attack, preceded by a 2.5-hour artillery barrage, went in against Ancre Wood, where the 1st Yorks were, at about 6 o'clock in the morning. They were hit the hardest, and accounts actually of their struggle, and I have been looking very hard, are rare. All contact between forward companies and battalion HQ was lost at around 2:30 a.m. The first they knew what was going on was when advance parties of the German attack appeared on the ridge in front of them around 7 o'clock. The Germans set up a machine gun position on the ridge and then pushed on again. Battalion HQ of the 1st East Yorks tried to make a stand, but were driven back. The Germans came straight through them, pretty much. The official history credits 1st East Yorks with putting up a particularly effective resistance in Ancre Wood. But having done that, only 3 officers and 30 other ranks were able to escape. And the battalion lost its commanding officer too, Lieutenant Colonel Coles, killed in the action. By mid-morning, the Germans had also broken through on the left and were threatening the Vierstraat line, way down there. Soon after midday, the village of Vierstraat fell into German hands. At about this time, the 9th Coilies, having had their breakfast interrupted by a gas attack, very unfortunate, at around 6:30, moved up onto the high, I put high in inverted commas here in my notes, on the high ground of Hill 40. That's where that concentration of yellow is towards the left. I call it Hill 40. I have stood on Hill 40. It's actually not as high as this banking here, I'm afraid. It's quite a small hill. But anything like that around Ypres, of course, is worth having, isn't it? From there, they watched the French troops on their right retreat, behind them mainly, and according to Lieutenant Colonel McCulloch's diary, in a more or less demoralised fashion. 8:30, orders came from Brigadier General Headlam to hold Hill 40 and stop any German advance. He added reassuringly that a detachment from the tank corps was on its way to protect the flanks. Unfortunately, that didn't mean tanks. That meant 10 Lewis gun teams who'd taken the guns out of the tanks and they'd come up on foot. But they were useful. He also ordered the 15th DLI forward at about 10 to 10. Keep that time in mind. 10 to 10. A number of German 5.9s have been landing among the 9th Coilie men on Hill 44, but they eventually, during a lull, you'll be very pleased to know, managed to get their breakfasts finally. And just after midday, the Germans were seen advancing from the Vierstraat-Kemmel road. They finally decided to have a go. Accurate and concentrated small arms fire seemed to catch the Germans by surprise, and they were forced back temporarily. The Germans were also seen advancing to the right of the Coilie positions, but they had one field gun on that hill, and they put it to immediate use, and the Germans withdrew from that push. Once the Durhams had finally turned up, it took them until 2:30. Remember, the order was given at 10 to 10. The DLI diary says that we moved off immediately. Heaven knows where they went in the meantime then. They claimed they'd set off straight away, but they got there eventually, about 2:30. And a company of the Black Watch formed a defensive flank on the right as well, and actually the Germans proved very reluctant to make any further moves. They decided to dig in where they were. As I've said though, of course, the main thrust of the attack was through Kemmel anyway, and this was a sort of secondary push. The action had cost the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry 24 fatalities, and the CO, McCulloch, he'd been wounded only slightly in the face and remained at duty. The Durhams lost 8 men when they got there. So at the end of the day, I'm going to take off all the arrows and everything. The Allied defensive line is actually the yellow dotted line. I hope you can see it. It's in front of the coiler positions, and then it moves forward to the Vierstraat line towards the top of the map. At 11:30 p.m, the 9th Coilers received new orders. The following morning, they were to take part in a counterattack, and the French were to do likewise, and they were going to recapture Mount Kemmel and retake the village of Vierstraat. That was the direction of the 9th Coilie proposed attack. They will be accompanied by a creeping barrage. I'm going into a little bit of detail on this one because it's quite important for the whole overall picture. The brigades on either flank would conform with their advance. They'd be going off at about 4:25 in the morning. And the plan very quickly fell apart. McCulloch later described it as a good example of a very badly organised counterattack. The account actually can be quite brief. The creeping barrage was feeble. The troops on either side of the Coilies didn't move from their trenches. The Coilies did actually send men out to say, "Where are you guys? What's happening?" One battalion said, "We haven't received any orders, we're not moving." And on the other side, they said, "We're not moving, people out there are shooting at us." More or less. So they didn't move. In the centre, of course, the Coilies did go forward. C Company in the middle, under our old friend Captain Ellenberger, there he is again. They advanced over 1,000 yards, about 1,200 yards, and captured 70 prisoners. But the other companies who went out with them were forced to form defensive flanks because, of course, they were being enfiladed from the German positions on either side. And the assault had faltered by about 11 o'clock. And unfortunately, C Company and the rest of them were forced back to positions, in the end, about 400 yards ahead of where they started. And the French counterattack also failed. One positive note, I suppose, Ellenberger got a bar to his military cross. The fighting died down. Georgette had failed overall for the Germans, but it cost the 21st Division over 3,000 casualties. Once more, drafts flooded in to replace the losses. And the 21st Division, thankfully, finally, was sent to a nice, quiet sector. They were sent down along with 8th, 25th and 50th Divisions, forming a new 9th Corps under Lieutenant General Gordon, and they were to rest and recuperate in the French sector way down south near the town of Reims, just on the eastern edges of the Chemin des Dames Ridge. 16 days later, the Germans launched their third massive offensive of the spring, Blücher-Yorck, across the Chemin des Dames Ridge, just where the 21st Division had been sent to rest. On the day of the attack, British positions were as follows. The blue lines there are the rivers and canals. Reims is not on that map, it's just off the bottom right-hand corner. But importantly, there is a canal that heads down to Reims, which becomes important in the battle later on. That's the 21st Division sector. Just to the left of that, you can see 8th Division and 50th Division, also British. I haven't included the rest of the map because all that particular part is then taken over by the French. By about this time, Marshal Foch had laid down the principles of defence in depth to his commanders. In other words, a lightly held front line and a battle zone where enemy incursions would be brought to a halt. General Duchesne, who was commanding French 6th Army, and therefore this sector on the Chemin des Dames, did not embrace this doctrine, shall we say. He was of the opinion that a sector so close to Paris, on a ridge that had been won at such devastating cost to the French the previous year, no ground at all should be voluntarily surrendered to the enemy. Accordingly, he placed most of his troops, including those of the 4 British divisions, in the front line. Now, Foch, of course, had a choice. He could dismiss Duchesne or give way to his subordinate. He chose the latter course. However, Lieutenant General Gordon, commanding 9th Corps and his divisional commanders went to protest to Duchesne. They got a curt reply. J'ai dit, he said. I have spoken. So, that was it. Too many units, therefore, were in position to the east of that canal. 11 companies out of the 3 brigades there. When the Germans attacked on the morning of the 27th of May, the ridge itself was very quickly overrun, meaning that the 21st Division positions were almost immediately outflanked on the left. That's the main thrust of the German attack. And at many points during the next few days, the same things happened. The Germans were pushing down into positions behind the British lines. Let's take a closer look. The British positions are at the very top there, and the other ones you can see as we move down are positions on the following 3 nights. On the 27th of May, 21st Division's positions were basically facing northeast, but because of the outflanking again and again and again, by the evening of 29th of May, the remaining units were facing almost due west, down at the bottom of the map. Let's zoom in again. As the German artillery bombardment began at 1 o'clock on the 27th, 62nd Brigade, on the left there, the red square, reported very little shelling on their positions, most of the shells falling on the rear areas. At 3:40, the German artillery began to target the front line and attacked almost immediately after. Yes, they did attack. None of the war diaries agree on the exact time of the assault, and it's not that surprising because a lot of the people didn't make it back across the canal anyway to report it. On the extreme left, 12th, 13th Northumberland Fusiliers were immediately pushed back across the main road, and the front positions of the 2nd Links were very quickly surrounded. Only 2 officers and 30 other ranks of the 3 companies east of the canal managed to get back. The reserve battalion 1st Links was soon in the thick of it, and by 10 o'clock it became clear that the Germans had broken through on the left. The troops of 110th Brigade managed to hold out for a while, but when La Neuville fell, which is the town just behind their sector, all 4 companies of the 7th and 8th to the east of the canal were cut off. The rest of the brigade tried to hold each line of trenches in turn, and by 4 p.m. they were still holding out just about in the little system of trenches you can see just at the bottom of the screen near the village of Corroy. On the 64th Brigade front, D Company of the 9th Coilies, another unit east of the canal, fought stubbornly, holding the German frontal assault for about an hour with concentrated Lewis gun fire, but they were eventually surrounded and overrun. 2 officers and half a dozen men made it back across the canal. To the west of the canal, the rest of the battalion was concentrated in a series of redoubts. And with 1 bridge unfortunately remaining intact over the canal, they had orders to destroy them, but one of them, it didn't happen. Each of these redoubts was surrounded and then bombarded into submission. We return to our old friend Captain Ellenberger here. He was commanding C Company in one of those redoubts, and he disappeared. In his papers at the Imperial War Museum, there are 2 letters home to his parents, one from the CO and the official telegram announcing his death, and the letter from the CO giving some details of how he was killed. Luckily, the 3rd document in that section is the letter from Ellenberger, who sent it home from the prisoner of war camp that he'd been sent to. He had actually been captured, and he survived the war. On the extreme right, 1st East Yorks suffered a very similar fate to C Company. D Company, who were ahead of the canal, just disappeared. There are no reports of what happened to them. There are no reports of anybody getting back. As I say, the other units held on to their redoubts as long as they could, but with the units on their left already in retreat and the Germans threatening to cut them off completely, they got down to about there by now. They withdrew to positions west of the village of Hermonville, which is the top section up there. 8 o'clock that evening, the positions were like that. There was no sign at all of the 7th and 8th Leicesters. What was left of them, little bits, was formed into a composite battalion as part of the 6th Leicesters under Lieutenant Colonel Chance. When they were there, they sent out runners to see if they could find any units to the right and left. No, they couldn't. Everybody else had gone. So a withdrawal to Pévy, which is to the left, was ordered. I haven't put an arrow on that one because they didn't actually go there in the end. The 6th Leicesters and 9th Coily just didn't receive that order either. The former moved off at about 3:30 the following morning, and the good old 9th Coily stayed put with a few stragglers from other battalions, holding off, shall we say, a less than energetic attack from the Germans. Another attack in the morning saw the CO McCulloch hit in the side by a bullet, and he was forced to head off to hospital, leaving Lieutenant Walby in command. By now the 9th Coily were down to platoon strength. Again threatened by German troops outflanking them on the left. That's why they didn't go to Pévy. At 6:10, the order to hold the present line became redundant, and they headed back for the town of Trigny, which is down to the south. So on the afternoon of the 28th of May, a line, sort of mixed up units, including some French troops, was more or less as marked there in the centre of the slide. At 15:15, a contradictory, I would call it, order came along. It said they were to hold the line at all costs unless a withdrawal became necessary. Well, it did. By 3:30 it was clear the Germans were across the Vale River, swarming up the ridge towards their positions, which they'd now come down to here. It was pot luck as to whether units received the orders to withdraw. The first links didn't move until after 9 o'clock, 1st East Yorks and 15th TLI 1:30, and yet again, poor old 9th Coily didn't get the order at all. A recce by an officer doing his rounds at 3 o'clock in the morning discovered that everybody else had gone. So for want of a better phrase, they scalped. So the morning of the 29th of May, they were holding that railway line across the bottom part of the slide, to the south of the Vale River. It soon became clear that being outflanked to the left was appearing inevitable yet again. The right flank stood their ground, and luckily didn't actually get much of an attack against them. 110th Brigade and 62nd Brigade units were sent to occupy Hill 202, which is right at the bottom of the slide. The Germans attacked the hill at about 2 o'clock, but they were held off. But they then set up machine guns to the south of the hill as they were outflanking them yet again, and were able to sweep the reverse slope of that hill with their fire. An attack at 4 o'clock was repelled, but the Germans then contented themselves in just shelling the hill. And during the bombardment, Lieutenant Colonel Chance, commanding the 6th Leicesters, was killed. He's commemorated on the Soissons Memorial. His body was never found. A third attempt at taking the hill about 8 o'clock that night proved successful, and the remnants of the garrison withdrew to Rosnay Farm, which is right on the bottom end of that slide. 21st Division's involvement in this battle was about to come to an end, thankfully. The French 45th Division arrived to take over the sector that night. Orders to pull out of the line were gratefully received, and by the end of May, the men were in billets, well to the south and out of the firing line. Casualties, as you can imagine, were heavy. But please note, again, over 76% of them were classified as missing, and once again, most of these ended up as prisoners of war. Most of the unit war diaries, not surprisingly, put the blame for this, what shall we say, disaster, fiasco, call it what you will, squarely on the shoulders of General Duchesne. And French High Command seemed to have agreed. He was relieved of command on the 9th of June. By the end of June, after a proposed move to Belgium had been cancelled, 21st Division found itself in 5th Corps, 3rd Army, back on the Somme. The defensive battles were over. The advance to victory was about to start. So we come to August 1918. Now, by this time in the war, Major General Campbell was lucky in having 3 of the best brigade commanders in the army. That's not my opinion, that's the opinion of Professor Peter Simpkins. Who were they? There they are, Brigadier General George Gator, Andrew McCulloch, and Hanway Cumming. Peter Simpkins writes that these, and I quote, truly outstanding brigade commanders were well equipped to meet the demands of decentralised command in the semi-open warfare of the 100 days. Well, 21st Division's first taste of this new phase of the war was on the night of 23rd, 24th of August, in a daring attack parallel to the River Ancre. A little bit of context very briefly for this. This followed the success of 4th Army at the Battle of Amiens. 3rd Army was now pushing on through the old Somme battlefield in the direction of Bapaume and Péronne. And the attack on 21st of August saw units of 21st Division advance along the Serre-Miramont Ridge, which is above the Ancre River up there, capturing Beaucourt and managing to get a foothold on the southern banks of the Ancre. Following day, the 18th Division captured Albert, and subsequent plans looked to take out the German positions on the Thiepval Heights with a pincer move, outflanking them to the north and the south. The town of Miramont, which is top right, just sort of half on the map there, was still in German hands though. And it was decided that the high ground to the southeast of it, which is the dotted line circled there, Hill 135, needed to be retaken and retaken very quickly to stop the garrison destroying the bridges over the Ancre prior to the attack. This task fell to 21st Division. Time pressure meant that the assault would go in at night. Well, in fact, that night. Initial orders were issued at 3:15 in the afternoon of the 23rd of August. 64th Brigade would lead off as far as the red line, which you can see straight down the centre of the map. 110th Brigade would then leapfrog and push on to the green dotted line on the extreme right. Well, plans, as they say, rarely survive first contact with the enemy. These didn't survive the afternoon. At about 5:30, McCulloch was summoned to Divisional HQ, where he was told, sorry, but 64th Brigade are going to make the entire advance on their own, and not at 1 a.m, you're going in at 11:30. McCulloch later wrote down his thoughts in his diary. I don't know whether he shared them with HQ or not, but he wasn't happy with the new plan. He thought that a 3-mile unsupported advance at night, quote, appeared somewhat ambitious. A verbal briefing of his battalion commanders at an impromptu conference was all McCulloch had time for. I got that sketch, actually. It was drawn by Lieutenant Howard of the 1st East Yorks, and it's in the 1st East Yorks magazine. If anybody has ever stood on the top of Hawthorne Ridge and looked up towards Hill 135, you'll very easily spot the fact that those hills are a bit exaggerated. It gives a vague idea of where they were going up the valley of the Ancre, but it looks a bit more like the Alps than the Somme. Let's look at the terrain. Let's start with an empty map. You can see the Ancre River going across from bottom left up to top right. You've got the Ulster Tower there now, down the bottom left. Thiepval Wood, the towns of Beaucourt and Grandcourt and Miramont, top. Peace, and then Courcelette, right down quite near the Albert to Bapaume road. And that is Audacious Cemetery, for those of you who've been there. The target hill 135 is just to the north of that. There are the jumping off trenches. There's the first objective, red line. Then you get the blue line. That one actually, the diaries say, well, we had about 3 valleys to get across. The only one that really deserves the definition of valley is the blue line there, which is Boom Ravine. The rest of them are just very, very gentle slopes that roads go along. And you have a green dotted line, which is the final objective, and there you have Hill 135. As I say, it fell to 64th Brigade. They crossed the Ancre from Beaucourt. They came from the other side of the river and lined up as follows. There they are. 1st East Yorks on the left, 9th Collie on the right, 15th DLI in support. Now this was taking place at 11:30 at night. It was dark, of course. In an attempt to maintain some sort of cohesion and direction of the attack, 10 yards in front of the centre of the leading formation, out on his own, was Captain Ennals of the 9th Coily, who, compass in hand, would act as a guide. So it was a case, okay lads, follow me. And off he went. The artillery barrage started at about 11:15, and the men set off into the darkness. At first, no sign of the enemy, a clearly unsuspecting enemy. In fact, the only initial problem was when some of the heavy artillery failed to lift at the correct time. 5 shells fell amongst the forward companies of the 9th Coilies. One of these knocked the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Greenwood, off his feet, throwing him against a wooden post. Badly bruised he was. He got up, however, and continued to lead his men. Luckily, the Germans in Battery Valley didn't open fire until the 64th Brigade men were within about 15 yards. And by then it was too late to stop their bayonet charge. They took the position and captured 30 men, 1 machine gun and a small artillery piece. They pushed on and arrived at the Red Line shortly after 1 o'clock. 9th Coily dug in as McCulloch ordered a pause for reorganisation. The 1st East Yorks on the left veered off as they were supposed to and mopped up the village of Grandcourt. Now they were taking some machine gun fire from the exposed right flank. If you remember, there's no British attack going on that right flank. And McCulloch was relieved finally to see some 15th DLI units come up level with them at about 2:15. He decided to postpone the next part of the advance till about 3:15 in the morning. He didn't dare make it any later, as he wanted to have at least half an hour of darkness on that final objective in which to dig in and organise his defences. They went forward again at the appointed time, causing the German garrison in Boom Ravine to beat a hasty retreat, leaving many of their weapons behind them as they scrambled out of the valley. Machine gun fire from the right flank again and from dead ahead didn't stop them reaching Hill 135 at 4:30. 15th DLI, having fought off a German attack on their right as they crossed Boom Ravine, arrived on the Coilies' flank at about 5:15. And the 1st East Yorks, still dawdling around in Grandcourt it seems, only managed to form a defensive flank on the left about 1,000 yards behind them. All 64th Brigade had to do now was hold on. And there they were. In the meantime, McCulloch had gone to try and liaise with the 15th DLI on his right, but just as he found them, he was hit in the thigh by a machine gun bullet and was carried back out of action by some Germans that he'd captured. Captain Spicer, Brigade Major of 64th Brigade, gave his own slant on the episode. I quote, "General McCulloch was wounded by our own men, I regret to say. He would go gallivanting ahead, catching Boche prisoners himself. And when he turned back, he was, not unnaturally, shot by our own men." 64th Brigade's position was precarious. The Germans had worked around both flanks and were pouring machine gun fire into their positions from front, right and left. Some Germans had filtered back into Boom Ravine and as far back as Battery Valley. The 64th Brigade men on Hill 135 were invited to surrender. Their reply was definitely in the negative and probably not very polite. The promised support was slowing arriving. 110th Brigade units, they turned up on the battlefield, set off around 5 o'clock. But they had to fight their way forward. Of course, they were encountering troops in Battery Valley again, so 6 Leicesters were asked to clear them out. Their advance continued but stalled again under heavy machine gun fire from the right as they crossed Boom Ravine. 2 companies of the 7th Leicesters were sent out to protect that right flank, and they ended up overrunning 4 machine gun posts and getting as far as Courcelette. Way off course, but there we go. Meanwhile, back on Hill 135, the morning mist had burnt off and British troops of 42nd Division could be seen advancing along the heights north of the Ancre, top of the map, towards Miramont. Suddenly, at this point, enemy fire ceased and the Germans began to withdraw, realising, of course, that they were now about to be outflanked. Both Lieutenant Howard of the 1st East Yorks and Lieutenant Colonel Greenwood of the 9th Coily stood up, climbed out of their shell holes and were able to walk about and assess the situation. They could begin the evacuation of the wounded. In front of their positions, 64th Brigade men counted 130 German dead. 110th Brigade, not before time, arrived to extend the defences along the green dotted line. The attack by 64th Brigade had contributed, as hoped, to the general advance. Thiepval Ridge fell, and 5th Corps to the south went on to capture La Boisselle, Ovier and Pozières, all within 24 hours. Different story to 1916. 21st Division casualties for this audacious night attack could be regarded, I think, as relatively light. We jump to October. 21st Division was involved in the general advance through September, start of October, capturing at one point much of the ground they had stubbornly held back in March around Épée. And then they took part in the capture of the Beaurevoir line following the breaking of the Hindenburg line. That map is typical of that part of the advance. That was 21st Division's line of attack, and you can see they made quite a lot of ground through September. Shows you the speed of the Allied advance through September and October mainly there. I'll pick the story up exactly 2 months after the previous episode, 23rd, 24th October, which this was the latter stages, I suppose, of the Battle of the Selle, as the British pushed their line forward towards the Forest of Mormal. Again, don't worry about that being a little complicated, I will simplify it. This was no brigade level attack. This time 21st Division advance was part of a much wider assault involving 1st, 3rd and 4th armies. The objective was the Hermann II position, which ran through the fortified villages to the west of the Forest of Mormal. Now the Germans had had a little breathing space since the last Allied attack, and although their trench systems were still relatively poor, they'd established and strengthened strong points and machine gun nests, strongly wired and positioned to cover the approaches to every village and every wood. 5th Corps was allocated a succession of 5 objectives, which involved the capture of 3 villages. Ovier, a different one, not the one on the Somme, Vendegie-au-Bois and Poix-du-Nord. The artillery barrage would be substantial, although they decided they wouldn't bombard the villages themselves, as they still had a large number of French civilians still in residence. 5th Corps was only given 6 tanks though, so they didn't play a huge part. To reach the final objective, it was an advance of over 9,000 yards. You can see the jumping off point, and you can see the red line, the green line and the brown line way up at the top there. I'll say about 9,000 yards. The brown line was supposed to be reached by 3:20 that afternoon. Well, let's see. 64th Brigade were on the right hand side, 1st East Yorks, 9th Coily. 110th Brigade on the left, 7th Leicesters and the 1st Wiltshire's, who had just joined the division quite recently. Just visible at the top of the right-hand corner map is the green dotted line. That was where they were supposed to be heading. 62nd Brigade would then take over and leapfrog. 3 tanks were to assist in clearing the village of Ovier by working around the edges, one to the north, one to the south. The artillery bombardment came down on time at 2 o'clock in the morning of the 23rd, and the infantry set out immediately. There they go. They reached the red dotted line on time and with little trouble. The next objective proved more of a challenge, however. The 7th Leicesters on the left was subject to enfilade and machine gun fire from Red House, which is marked just out of the 21st Division sector. 5th Division they weren't actually quite keeping pace with 21st, so the Germans were free to enfilade. The 1st Wilts were taking casualties from the machine gun fire from the village of Ovier as well. On the right, 64th Brigade had by now also run into difficulties. 9th Coily on the right were held up by fire from a machine gun posts that 33rd Division, who were actually advancing quite quickly on the right, had missed as they went. They bypassed it. There it is, just appeared, little red square. It was on a ridge overlooking the approaches to the village and had a clear view of the Coilies as they struggled forward. Stepped forward Lieutenant Colonel Greenwood, commanding officer. He realised that this machine gun had to be eliminated, and quickly. Single-handedly, he rushed up the slope, took the machine crew by surprise and killed all 4 of them with his revolver. He and 2 battalion runners were forced to repeat this action of gallantry very soon afterwards, as the battalion was held up again by other machine guns just to the east of the village. There. With the help of the 2 tanks, the village was cleared, and the 7th Leicesters, having flanked it to the north, there they go, the top arrow, had taken up positions in the sunken road. They then pushed on to the Red Line, along with 2 companies of the Wiltshires. The baton was now passed to 6th Leicesters, and as they crossed the Red Line, they were immediately pinned down by machine gun fire from the edge of Duke's Wood. One company worked its way around the southern flank of the wood and reached the chateau. Realising they'd been outflanked, the machine gunners retired and the green dotted line was reached about 10 a.m. On the right, the 9th Coily, having left one company to form a defensive flank on the right and down to about 250 rifles, had actually got forward quicker than the 1st East Yorks and found themselves in the open to the south of Duke's Wood. There they go. They met a German counterattack coming the other way. Greenwood and his men repulsed it with a bayonet charge, capturing 150 prisoners, 8 machine guns and 1 field gun on the way to the objective. So with their work completed for the day, 64th and 110th Brigade battalions took up positions as follows. There they go. Patrols were sent out to the village of Audacious, which is the one by Duke's Wood. That's a picture of it at the time. You can see the wood, you can see the chateau, and the village is top left of the photograph. And of course, it was found to be still full of French civilians, as I'd said. Now, the advance to the Green Line was down to 62nd Brigade, and the 3 battalions lined up as so. 1st Links, 2nd Links, 12th, 13th Northumberland Fusiliers. Momentum was lost at this stage of the attack. The 2nd Links on the right squeezed past Vendegie-aux-Bois and then came under enemy shell fire. The 2nd Links then pushed on towards the Green Line. Heavy machine gun fire from the high ground west of the village of Poix-du-Nord, which is towards the right of the screen there, and substantial shelling from the German field artillery brought them up a little short. Orders to continue the attack were preempted by a German counterattack, and with the Lincolnshires dug in along the road and with the Northumberland Fusiliers having got no further than the village itself, it was decided that that was enough for the day. The attack was to be resumed at 4 o'clock the following morning. 62nd and 64th Brigades began the advance. On the left, the advance to the Brown Line was over very, very quickly. 1st Links, with only 3 other ranks killed and 32 wounded, reached that line by 6 o'clock. On the right, in contrast, 64th Brigade were held up almost immediately by a heavily wired position on a shallow ridge directly in front of them, which had a whole series of machine gun posts. They were stuck there for about 2 hours. A frustrated Lieutenant Colonel Greenwood decided to take a look for himself and crept out towards this German line. He found a weak spot. One sector of the ridge was held by a solitary machine gun out of sight of the others. So he crawled to within about 20 yards of it and stood up and rushed the post, taking the crew by surprise and again killing them all with his revolver. He was then able to direct his men through this gap in the defences and were able to push on into Poix-du-Nord village itself. Meeting little resistance there, they pushed on to the Brown Line. At this point, another German counterattack was launched against them, but with Greenwood calmly walking up and down in front of his advanced posts to encourage his men, the attack was repulsed. By 10 o'clock, the support battalions came up alongside and were able to push on even further that afternoon, before calling it a day and digging in again for the night. No German counterattack was attempted, but the German artillery shelled the village of Poix-du-Nord. That's the only picture I could find of Poix-du-Nord afterwards, but it's just the one building, shelled after they'd been driven out by the Germans. Now, for his exploits on the 23rd and 24th of October, I'm sure you'll not find this much of a surprise, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Greenwood was awarded the Victoria Cross. His thoughts at the time were not recorded. But after the war, in a letter to his old friend, Captain Ellenberger, yes, he who was captured, he remarked, "I did nothing save drive on, kill a few Huns and cheer our fellows on a bit when they flagged. It was topping fighting really, and I wouldn't have missed it for anything." Quite typical of Harry Greenwood, apparently. The next major offensive on the Western Front was the Battle of the Sambre, 4th of November 1918. If you want to read a really good detailed book on that, there's probably one I can recommend. The 21st Division unfortunately missed out. Well, was it unfortunate? I don't know. They missed out. They'd been sort of leapfrogging the 17th Division pretty much on a regular basis for the last two and a half months. And it turned out for that particular day it was the 17th Division's turn, and they attacked through the Forest of Mormal. 21st Division joined in the subsequent pursuit, shall we call it, on the eastern side of the forest on the second day of the battle. Again, we're talking quite an advance here. The Forest of Mormal is just off the left-hand side of the screen, or it would be anyway. 17th Division had struggled to push through the forest on the 4th of November, but success either side saw the Germans withdraw, meaning that 62nd Brigade with 1st Links and 12th 13th Northumberland Fusiliers in front, let's zoom in there, were able on the morning of the 5th of November to advance largely unopposed towards the river and the town of Berlaymont, which they found absolutely clear of enemy troops. Unfortunately, they found that all the bridges over the river, at least they thought so, had been destroyed. So they were content to take up positions short of the town and await developments. A good move, as it happens, because the Germans shelled Berlaymont all the way through that afternoon and into the night. This didn't stop patrols going forward to check out the possibility of somehow getting across the river. The 1st Links patrol tried to rig up a temporary crossing at the lock, which is marked centre bottom end. But the Royal Engineers in the meantime found an intact bridge that everybody else hadn't noticed. It was prepared for demolition, but they were able to remove the explosive charges, and around 3 o'clock in the morning on the 6th, 2 companies of the 1st Links were able to cross under machine gun fire, as it happened, but they managed to establish a bridgehead, taking 20 or so prisoners in the process. About midday, orders came to the effect they were to be relieved by 110th Brigade, and they moved back into billets into Berlaymont. 62nd Brigade had, unknowingly at this point, taken part in its last action of the war. 110th Brigade were to continue the advance. The next objective being the village of Aulnoy, which is centre right there. Machine guns in the village had hampered their crossing of the river over a hastily improvised rickety bridge with no handrails at night in the rain, with a swift flowing current beneath them. They took it steady going across. All the 6 Leicesters, the first across, they were able to do was advance cautiously northwards along the eastern river bank as far as the factory. That's the small arrow just to the south of the town. Rather than risk a frontal assault on the village, it was decided it could be outflanked to both the north and the south. Accordingly, 7th Leicesters went around the northern outskirts. You can see the arrow at the top. 1st Wiltshires performing the same manoeuvre to the south. Round they went. Fearful of encirclement, most of the German garrison beat a hasty retreat, allowing the 6 Leicesters eventually to move in and mop up a few remaining stragglers. By 6 o'clock that evening, 110th Brigade was safely on its final objective along the road running north-south through Etré and Quatre-Bras. You can't quite see it. It pretty much runs down the right edge of the map. Now, it was vital at this point, during the final days, to keep up the idea of a pursuit, that the Germans were given no respite, no time to establish proper defensive lines, so the order came to push forward the following morning, the 7th of November. 110th would be leading the way once more. First objective was the Red Line. It seems to be drawn in the middle of nowhere on that. It happens to be along a ridge, so there is a certain topographical reason for their putting the line there. To the west of the village of Limont-Fontaine, which is just off the map. Once 110th Brigade had secured this line, 64th Brigade would move through onto the second objective, the Blue Line, having cleared Limont-Fontaine. Blue Line way to the east again. 0 hour was 05:45. 7th Leicester's on the left, 1st Wiltshire's on the right, following a creeping barrage. As the men set off, it became clear the Germans had withdrawn some distance during the night, a typical story of that time. The village of Bachon, which you can see at the top, on the left flank was found to be clear of enemy troops, and both battalions soon reached the red line and began to dig in. They'd advanced with 33rd Division to the south, 5th Division to the north, and unfortunately 5th Division hadn't quite kept up, and 7th Leicester's at the former defensive flank facing to the north. Brigadier Cumming, commanding 110th Brigade, had established his brigade HQ initially in a brewery in Aulnoy, good move, at about 7:30, but then moved on to Ancre, where he reported that they were, and I quote, received everywhere with open arms by the inhabitants who were crazy with joy at being free once more. Flowers and everything they had, mostly coffee, were pressed on the troops and flags sprang out everywhere. 110th Brigade had now also completed their last action of the war. It had cost the 7th Leicester's 10 fatalities and the 1st Wiltshire's just 1 man. So at 9 o'clock, 64th Brigade passed through the red line positions and took up their attacking positions. There we are again. 15th DLI on the left, 1st East Yorks on the right, 9th Coily in support. As they launched their attack, they walked straight into an enemy artillery barrage and heavy machine gun fire. The Germans weren't going to give up Limont-Fontaine, it seemed, without a fight. 5th Division was still not up on the left, and 15th DLI found themselves taking enfilade fire from that flank. Brigade HQ had to send a machine gun section out to cover that flank before 15 DLI were able to continue their advance. And they were by now, not surprisingly, some distance between the 1st East Yorks. D Company had crossed the Grimoire River, which is the blue line running down here, and had taken up positions in the quarry just beyond the ford marked on the map. C Company also crossed the river, but in trying to establish touch with the Durhams on the left, had been forced to form a defensive flank of their own. And about 1:15 that afternoon, the 1st East Yorks commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Dumoulin, was killed. Although the 15th DLI did manage to cross the river, well, I've said river twice now, it's not much more than a large stream, I suppose. It was clear the advance had stalled. Orders went forward telling the Durhams and the East Yorks to dig in where they were. The attack would be resumed under a rearranged artillery barrage at 5 o'clock that evening. This time, the 9th Coily would lead the attack, with 15th DLI going in on their left flank. The attack did go in on time, and the only detailed account of this attack that I've ever found is in the 9th Coily diary, and even this is short of detail, if not hyperbole. That's the town of Limont-Fontaine, and that's the direction of the attack. I quote from the diary and make no excuses for the way it's put. The 9th Coily, covered by supporting fire, advanced. From now onwards, this battalion, ably led, made excellent progress and literally carried everything before it by sheer determination and will to win. A strong stand was made by the enemy, but all to no purpose. In the fierce fighting that took place in front and in the streets of the villages, the men of 9th Coily refused to be denied victory. Once again, the enemy were outmanoeuvred and outfought. And I say that is the only account that I know that exists of the taking of that village. It was all over by 9:30 that night. And after quite a bit of hand-to-hand fighting in the streets, both Limont-Fontaine and Ancre, which is the village just beyond it, were liberated. It had cost the 9th Coily 16 casualties, including 2nd Lieutenant Archibald Hunter, aged 19, who had only joined the battalion 3 weeks before. The attack also resulted in the death of a VC recipient. Captain A.M. Lascelles, 15th Durham Light Infantry, killed in Limont-Fontaine. He had won his VC on the 3rd of December 1917 when serving with the 14th DLI in 6th Division. The 15th DLI's 2 attacks that day cost them 25 fatalities. During the night of the 7th, 8th of November, 64th Brigade units were relieved by 51st Brigade and moved back into billets in Berlaymont. Next 2 days were spent reorganising and resting. The division was informed of the armistice on the 11th as they were marching forward to new billets in Limont-Fontaine. They were still there on the 18th of November when the local priest organised a memorial service in the village church in memory of those who had fallen in its liberation. 10 officers and 50 men from each battalion of the 64th Brigade were able to attend. In what was actually a bombed out church, the priest in his speech apologised for the state of the building. A wreath was presented to the brigade. I'll finish on one final slide. Shall we call it the balance sheet, if I may? It shows the casualties in the defensive actions of the spring and in the attacks of summer and autumn. Now, considering that those captured in the German spring offensives are actually part of that 13,000 figure, I reckon the table shows that whichever phase of the year we look at, defence or attack, the cost is, sadly, roughly the same. And I'll close there. Thank you very much.